as Brittany said, we're going to give an update on the Apple Tree Project, but also we're just going to kind of talk about, talk about the history of apple trees in this area in general. So there are some apple trees that are pretty well known to residents and have been well known for a long time. They tend to be the ones that are on multi-generational farms or are in sort of downtown Boulder neighborhoods, and kids know where to get these apples to eat sometimes, but I've also heard a fair amount of kids like to throw them at each other. So yeah, a lot of apples are actually quite well known and part of the culture even today. But there are also some that have remained hidden. And so this is right outside of El Dorado Springs. And in this copse of trees here, there's actually an apple tree that we sort of found early on in 2018 that we sampled and surveyed. And so what looking at these hidden and the known apple trees can give us is quite a few things. We've been able to sort of foster opportunities for education and in particular foster connections to local environments and cultures and history in the Boulder area. And of course, actually have found some really delicious apples. So we get food. As researchers, we've eaten a lot of apples, which is great. And then also hoping to share those historic cultivars with the community. So one of my favorite parts really about doing apple tree history is the layers. The layers of meaning that apples have had and their layers of uses today. So Brittany already told you what the Apple Tree Project is about, but just so you get a sense of kind of how broad it really is, there's sort of three main components. One is that research piece. So there's some historical work here, but for the most part, this is in urban ecology. And so looking at, fire blight resistance and sort of heat islands and that kind of thing. And then there is work directly with the Boulder community, and this is where a lot of the history comes into play, doing research on particular areas of the city and the county so folks can know more about the historic apple trees that they live with. And then a third piece, which is really active on campus, is the undergraduate curriculum that comes out of this project. The basic idea is that students can connect with content, sort of big ideas about history and biology that they have to grapple with, especially when they're freshmen and sophomores. They actually can connect with that content a lot more effectively when it's hands-on and when it has sort of a local connection. So we have classes in biology, which have sort of subgroups, subclasses in genetics and ecology, and then we've also done one history class. So without further ado, diving into the actual history that we've uncovered. So first of all, how did apple trees get to Boulder? So for the most part, they came from a sort of Midwestern area. A lot of the cultivars certainly originated in the Northeast and the Southeast, kind of along the coast. But for the most part, I've found direct references to people who have moved from Ohio, Missouri, Minneapolis, Minnesota, to come and bring their apple trees, their cultivars, here to this area. Another big place that apple trees came from is actually California. So of course, as we know, California sort of developed its white settlement earlier than Colorado, and so it's actually already had an established agricultural economy. And so when some of the people coming over to the Front Range, they really wanted to invest in this area, in particular in agriculture, and kind of try to grow a business, they would order their trees from California. So they came here, some of them by wagon. There is this adorable story of a little tree coming over in a boot in a wagon. I've only found one of those references, but it is a treasure. Certainly, some of these apple trees came by mail order, sort of the advent of catalogs and being able to order specific trees and specific types of plants and fruits and seeds in the late 19th century had a part to do with apples coming here. And then also, I haven't found a lot of references to this in Boulder, but we do know that around this time, there were sort of traveling horticulturalists. If you can kind of imagine like door-to-door salesmen selling you, cosmetics or knives or whatever today. This was kind of the moment in which people were kind of going around and teaching people how to graft. Not a lot of people in the United States actually knew how to do that. It was much more popular to just sort of throw some seeds out. And so teaching folks how to graft, and also saying, hey, you know, I have this really particular type of cultivar. I've made it myself. It's really good in these conditions. Why don't you buy it from me? And so then who was really kind of consuming and planting these apple trees falls into two main categories. Homesteaders, which is sort of a catch-all term for anybody who came out whose main mission was to find a plot of land and set up their family there. And then the second group is, you know, business people, people whose they certainly brought their families out to the Front Range, but their kind of main idea wasn't to create, you know, a self-supporting farm, but it was rather, let's get a larger scale commercial venture going here and see if we can make some money. A lot of these folks tried to do that with mines first. Those had a pretty high failure rate, and of course closed down pretty quickly in general, and so they would transition to agriculture on the Front Range. So why apples? They're delicious, of course. They also have a few pretty neat historical or pretty neat qualities that create an interesting history. So one thing is they are versatile, right? You can use them for all sorts of things. Cider, which is where a lot of our early apple trees were likely grown for. You can make vinegar out of it, right? You can preserve it in all sorts of different ways for over the winter. You can, of course, eat it fresh. Depends on what variety you have, whether that's going to taste good or not. But there are so many different things you can do with an apple. So if you plant an apple tree, you know, it's like planting 3 or 4 different crops, right? Another thing is they have a high degree of variability, and they're quite adaptable plants. So there's sort of combination of the rootstock and the grafting. I always trip over this because I am the historian of the group, but basically the rootstock is what it sounds like. It can be from any variety, and of course in the late 19th century and early 20th century, folks at that time even were looking for sort of hardy cultivars to be their rootstock. And then you can actually graft any other kind of cultivar onto that rootstock, right? And so you can actually kind of combine different, you know, things that you like about different trees. So for the rootstock, it would be hardiness, right, for example. And the cultivar would be, well, do I want it to be good for cider? Do I want it to be good for eating, baking, that sort of thing? So it allows for adaptation, not only to new landscapes, but also to human need. Another great thing about the way that you can very quickly, just in one generation, sort of experiment and create a completely new cultivar is that there are so many varieties. And there were, sort of at the time that we're talking about, the pioneer time, so many different varieties for cold weather, for drought tolerance, for shorter growing seasons. So as people moved west, they were also adapting their apples to the new ecosystems that they found themselves in. And then finally, sort of one of my favorite characteristics of the apple tree is that it takes a while to come into full fruit, right? So it's like 6 to 10 years. And the federal government and other folks who were selling off land actually took advantage of this. And they would say, you know, if you want to have a land grant, that's great, but you need to plant, you know, there's an example of one in the Northwest territory of 50 apple trees, right? And so the idea there is trying literally to root people to a place and say, okay, we need you as a federal government to go into this new place and stay there for a while. What better way than forcing people to undertake a bunch of labor, plant an orchard, and then have to wait for that to actually come to fruition? I think it's quite an interesting history there. So there's this other piece, right? I've sort of gone through the practical elements of apples themselves that made them really important to these early white settlers. But there's also this element of the apple as a symbol, right? So we're familiar with this, American as apple pie, Johnny Appleseed, those kinds of ideas. But at the time, it was really sort of this, wasn't only for English people, but it was kind of this idea of, you know, civilizing a new area, right, to use the parlance of the time, making it look a certain way, creating your own garden, your own kind of uniform look to things, right? So this obviously shows up in a lot of different other parts of history. The Forestry Service is probably the most famous, but it certainly shows up here too. People really wanting to feel at home in some way and create order. And then another piece, of course, is apples were actually really important, and agriculture, of course, in general, in encouraging this idea of the West and even arid places like the Front Range, that it was this amazing verdant place where, you know, you just had to go. So I've taken out one of my favorite little quotes here, and I'll read it to you. It's from the Irrigation Era, which was a publication that really was funded by Denver business people and was just about trying to get investment, if not people to move out here to grow businesses, then certainly to invest from back east. So this is the quote. "Its wealth of gold and silver, fruits and grains, abundance of water for irrigation, and matchless climate. These are the natural elements of greatness that are just at this time attracting more attention than any territory of Western America. Just a little ways up from Denver, only 29 miles, is the town. All around on all sides, almost as large as the state of Connecticut, is the county, about evenly divided as to mountains and plains. In the mountains, vast beds of mineral-bearing ores, such as gold, silver, lead, iron, coal, etc., are found in unlimited quantities. In the valleys, the growing of fruit, general farming, and the stock industry are prominent." Right, so this is kind of an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the apple as a symbol and as a way to draw people westward. So coming back to my theme of loving the layers of apple history, this is a map that has little dots of all the apples, the apple trees that we sampled as of the fall of 2018. So it's a little dated, but this is the most recent map that we have. So as you can see, they kind of cluster. The ones that we surveyed, we've been focusing on the city, but even within the city, they kind of cluster downtown. So I kind of did this little thought experiment of, you know, where in Boulder, in this area, could we find the greatest intersection of the different types of people that were involved in apple history and bringing apples and sort of taking care of apples in sort of early history of the city of Boulder. So this, more or less, this little picture here that I've gotten more or less gets the main folks that I'm about to sort of list. So I'm sure that those of you who are really into Boulder history are quite familiar with Marinus Smith, right? He donated much of the land for the university and kind of made his way in Boulder by buying up a bunch of land early on and then selling it. But he also grew and cared for quite deeply some orchards in that area, and that's potentially where some of those apples that are in that area of the city, where they might come from. So he's kind of in the middle. He does a little real estate, right? But he also grows orchards because he kind of loves them. If you kind of read what he wrote and what was written about him. Then there's also just a little ways north in the old North Boulder neighborhood is Joseph Wolfe. He's also a pretty prominent character in Boulder history. His orchards were really a money-making enterprise. He also wrote of loving his apple trees, and he was known to, quote, baby talk his apple trees, which is pretty adorable. But make no mistake, he was growing them for money. He was growing them as a large commercial piece, or rather as a piece of his larger commercial fruit venture. And actually most famous and most successful for blackberries, but apples he also grew. Then in the Newlands neighborhood, you have a family that also, like Smith, made most of their money and were kind of planning to, sort of divide their property up and sell it. But they actually kind of had this thing where they wanted to divide up their property such that there would be apple trees on each plot, because they really believed that having an apple tree on a piece of property increased the value of that property and also kind of represented the way that they wanted people to live on the land, right? Also in this area on Pearl Street, sort of the west part of Pearl Street, was the Brearley family. And the Brearleys actually sold apples to miners up in Boulder Canyon, and they had actually a fruit orchard specifically for cider as well. And they also had a large vegetable garden. So this is an example of someone that could kind of qualify in more in the homesteader than in the kind of real estate or commercial venture category, But of course, they're also benefiting financially from their land and from what they're planting there. The final piece that relates to this map is the Yaqui family. So they had an apple orchard, and they had a little market stall in the 1930s that the women of the family ran, particularly this woman. I'll show you a picture of her in a minute, named Ikaminda Yaqui. And the stand was this stand right here. It's in the area where McGuckins is today. This is one of my favorite pictures, and it's one of my favorite little pieces of history. Just a reminder that, you know, oftentimes maybe women's and children's labor doesn't show up in sort of the level of Mariner Smith or Joseph Wolfe, or even some of the miners, right? But this is an important part of the local economy that, you know, you really can sometimes only see when you look at slightly odd things like the history of apple trees, right? To get you back to how women and children, for example, have actually, you know, helped their families and been an important part of the local economy. So what happened to the first apple trees? This has been a huge question for me that I have to say I don't really have the answer to, but I have a few possibilities. I have seen mentions of the following. Apparently, grasshoppers, as we all know, were bad, have been bad, and there are several mentions to particularly rough grasshopper years that may have affected the apples, the health of the apple trees. There was certainly, by the 1910s and really in full force by the 1920s, there were government efforts, largely coming out of CSU and the Extension Service, to encourage people to go after, you know, to grow uniform cultivars. This is sort of part of the federal government, you know, and local and state governments' efforts to, you know, try to get the best out there for people who were involved in agriculture, right? But their version of the best at the time was sort of 1 or 2 or 3 well-known apple varieties, and, you know, we do not actually want variety in our crop. Another question that I really just wanted to know, and I have not found any mention of it, but I just have to wonder about the temperance movement. If there were so many cider trees planted early on, and we know that it was really in the 1910s that the apple trees really started, the oldest apple trees really started to kind of disappear, whether that's from age or something else. I really want to know, like, was the temperance movement a part of that? I mean, did they take hatchets to these trees? I have no idea. The fact that I haven't seen any mentions of it yet probably means that it didn't really happen on a large scale. I have also seen 1 or 2 mentions of, you know, bad weather. It's generally pretty non-specific in that way, but that's another possibility, right? A particularly bad freeze or bad timing of a freeze can also be one of the ways that some of these older apple orchards started to disappear. But certainly there was a big survey undertaken in 1922 of various agriculture in this area of Colorado. And at that time, the writers noted that a lot of the earliest trees, and they would have been, you know, 30 to 50 years by that point, were not being really well cared for and were kind of, you know, losing. They were past their best bearing years. So the final, I hope this is the final thing to say because it's time to get on to this piece. But the real name of the game here in terms of what makes our area really special and really kind of fun is variety. So again, this is from 2018. Our wonderful colleague Amy made this. So you can see there are some really popular big chunks of the overall varieties, right? Certainly there were some of the most popular were planted quite a lot. And then you have these that are smaller chunks of the pie, and they also, you can see they're named. But if you see sort of in my top left, this sort of just, I mean, kaleidoscope of colors that are not labeled, it's almost a quarter of the apple trees. We do not have matches, like genetic matches for them in the USDA database. And so what that likely means is that they are unique, if not to the Boulder region, then certainly to this wider area, potentially in Colorado. But anyway, and that's really exciting because some of those apple trees that we don't know what they are actually taste really good and were clearly meant to be consumed and were planted and cared for by someone. And so these are apple trees that are kind of the most exciting for us because not only are they historic varieties, most likely, but they are also, you know, potentially unique to this area. I will say that I have tasted a couple spitters, these apples that, you know, kind of were grown from seed, and some of them do actually taste kind of good. So I do sometimes wonder if maybe there's just an occasional delicious spitter that makes it through and somehow, like, against nature actually tastes good. Because usually when apples grow from seeds, they, you know, couldn't care less about what humans want to do, and they taste how they want to taste. This is a list, and I'm happy to share this with anybody who would like it later on, but this is a list of all of the cultivars that we have found and identified on open space and public lands in particular. You can find the whole list and that pie on our website. These are the three that I sort of pulled out. They're more common, especially the Ben Davis in this area. And also these, if anybody's interested, are the three cultivars that are outside of the Dunn house. So anyway, just like for your information. And so another kind of neat thing about being able to identify the cultivars, as we've been able to do with some of them, is then you get to know a little bit more about where those cultivars came from. Because the Ben Davis, outside of, you know, your sort of like apple lovers groups, which there are a lot of them, and they are very passionate, of course. But outside of those groups, these really aren't well-known cultivars. And so the Ben Davis, I hadn't heard of it before joining this project. Where did it come from? So it likely started in North Carolina, and it seems like it actually made its way to Colorado and sort of westward, almost entirely like via under the Mason-Dixon line, right? So it shows up in Kentucky next, and it just sort of keeps moving westward. And this was actually one of the most famous, most well-used varieties in the 19th century. And the first mention I have found of it in the Boulder area is 1886. The first reference is in Colorado, is from the 1870s in Greeley. So also in Boulder County, and this comes from that survey, that 1922 survey that I mentioned. In Boulder County, there were apparently 1,224 of these, quite popular, as you can see. And nearly 400 of those were in the city of Boulder alone. So first of all, it shows you just how many apple trees were really being grown in the city of Boulder at that time, and also how popular the Ben Davis was. These other two, the Fameuse, for example, is a cultivar that actually originated in Canada, and it was also probably brought to this area as early as 1886. And then the McMahon, which may or may not be pronounced that way, is from Wisconsin. So those two are kind of these examples of cold hardy varieties that, you know, can kind of do well here in Colorado, that were developed in particular in places that, you know, needed it to be, needed their apple trees to be hardy. Now I will turn it over to Chance to talk about Apple GIS, and just let me know when you want me to switch the slide.
Great, yeah, I'm ready. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I got involved with the Boulder Apple Tree Project through an undergraduate EBIO course focusing on introducing undergrads to research. You know, what's it really like to go out and do a research project? And so Project Gradient is a kind of the handle for a lot of different subset projects that the Boulder Apple Tree Project is working on. So it involves urban ecology, leaf morphology, and genetics, and it's all centered on getting students out and surveying trees. So the tree on the left is actually on the chancellor's property for CU Boulder, kind of in a nice little field. And this is kind of how we go about and conduct our surveys, is we tag the tree, collect a sample of an apple, and core it, look at the seed size. And during the course of that class, we actually surveyed around 120 trees and collected those measurements as well as genetic samples. Next slide, please. So one of the other parts of that project, which introduced me to GIS and kind of using that to look for apple trees, was looking at how impervious surface may or may not affect how fire blight spreads. So the focus of the urban ecology section that I was a part of was looking at fire blight and kind of tracking if there's any sort of variable that increases risk or decreases risk and trying to identify that. So initially we were using impervious surface, just concrete, asphalt, things like that to see if there was any correlation between that and fire blight spread. And it actually turned out we were unable to say yes or no either way. We needed a lot more data. But it did get me to start to think about if we could limit our search areas in Boulder to regions more likely to possess apple trees that hadn't been surveyed yet. Because a big part of the project was, kind of driving around or riding a bike around Boulder and just looking for apple trees and seeing what neighborhoods they were in and getting permission to survey them from the property owners and conducting research that way. So one of the things I wanted to do is see if there was any way to limit those search areas to be more pertinent. Next slide, please. So that portion of the project was pretty difficult because there actually aren't many property maps left from that time period that we had access to. But CU does have a large collection of aerial photos from between the 1930s to the 1940s. And although this is kind of towards the end of the Apple era in Boulder, it was still useful to take a look at these photos. And as you can see, there are a lot of things that look like they may be orchards. Now, it's impossible to say whether that's an apple orchard or some other type of variety of plant, but what struck me was just how many areas in Boulder are these little orchard zones. And so I wanted to see if I could take that information and overlay it on current maps, which is what I did next. Next slide, please. So using GIS, I started to plot these photos over our current maps. And as you can see, the way that I did that was just drawing little boxes around what looked like orchards to me. And this created that layer that was useful and able to drop over our current map. If you click next, I think it'll pop up. Yeah, so this is our current map. And this is the road at the top is Linden, and on the far right is Broadway. So you can see just how concentrated some of these orchard zones are and how that's kind of interesting how they've been developed over time into these residential areas. And it was definitely useful for us as far as finding some more concentrated areas where there may be some of these unique cultivars, like Amelia mentioned, that are in that kind of 25% range where they're not documented by the USDA, but are really interesting and tasty and useful. Next slide. So the last step of this project was to go to these different orchards or not these different orchards, but to kind of go around these different properties and see if I could identify any apple trees there. And unfortunately, that was kind of cut short because of the quarantine that was issued. So we're still kind of in this time period for this project where there's more to do, which now that things are kind of getting back to normal, at least a little bit, is good news for this project. So one of the things that is so important about identifying these cultivars, like Amelia had mentioned, was not just the taste, but also, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with apples, but orchards tend to be grown as clones. So she had mentioned that an apple seed isn't going to taste, if you plant an apple tree from an apple seed, it's not going to taste at all like the tree that it was parented by. The genetic variation means that it could taste completely different. And sometimes you do get lucky, but a lot of times you don't. And so what's really interesting about documenting and getting some of this genetic information from all of these surviving trees that do taste good or are cold weather hardy is that a lot of modern orchards are clones of one individual tree, which makes them really susceptible to disease, just not very resilient. And that's in part why we were doing the fire blight experiment, as well as trying to just collect genetic information and try to identify new trees. So for the project now, essentially one of the other fun questions is, which trees survived urban development and why? One of the interesting bits of information that I got from my advisor about these like orchard zones was part of the development of these zones, part of the like residential development of these zones. One of the caveats was they had to leave one apple tree present. So if there was a big orchard that's now going to be, you know, turned into housing, one tree needs to be not torn down. And I'm unsure about the specifics about it. Like, was that tree required to be cared for, or was it not, or was you just had to not cut it down? There's a lot of variation in the information that I've found. But yeah, so it's that adds another element to the story behind those surviving trees. Next slide. So some of the preliminary findings, which were pretty interesting, is there are some areas that were concentrated with a lot of apple trees that didn't look like they were actually a part of any orchard that I found, at least that existed in the 30s. And one of those is at the end of Silver Lake Ditch. So there's this really high concentration of apple trees there, but no orchards present. And one of the theories that my advisors had was this idea that the ditch was there to irrigate agricultural properties. And so it's definitely possible that apple seeds and apples, would have floated down to the ditch and then kind of congregated in this area to the south at the very end of it and just kind of created this funky, ditch orchard of like a lot of different types of apples. So that was kind of a fun finding that I saw. We were really expecting to see an orchard overlapping that area. And so when we didn't, we were like, how's that possible? Additionally, so far in the preliminary surveys that I was able to do, I was able to visit about 15 of these orchard zones before the COVID lockdown, and around half had at least one previously unsurveyed apple tree. So one tree that the Boulder Apple Tree Project had not found yet was present on those properties. And that could be related to kind of what I mentioned earlier about how property developers were required to leave at least one tree standing. Okay, and that is all I have on GIS.
Yeah, so our final section is going to be kind of just a little bit more information on our methods and how have we gone about finding out about these historic apples and finding the apple trees themselves. So this kind of just tells you in a nutshell how much can go into identifying a cultivar. So we undertook genetic testing, ecological data from surveying, and one of the fun things that I've learned about ecology as a non-ecologist is that sometimes ecological research is just code for tasting apples and seeing if they taste good. So that's part of the ecological data. I'm describing the taste of various apples. Information from local farms, local property owners, and of course open space who's given us access to their trees, interviews with property owners, so talking to folks, which I love to do, but is not something that historians always get to do in their work. And then of course there's kind of like maybe your more typical ways of thinking about history. So archives, some of the bigger state and university archives, and then local archives. Shout out to Carnegie Library, a wonderful place. And then kind of like what Chance was talking about, he and I both have used historic maps and photos in our work. So the historical documents that I've drawn most heavily from have been newspapers, articles and whatnot, and then also advertisements within those newspapers. And then some nursery catalogs, government publications, photographs, maps. These are sort of your traditional historical documents that we've been able to use. Some of the challenges with those are that the importance and use of apple trees has oscillated through time, right? So that just means apple trees were really important in the 1880s and 1890s, and then they kind of weren't for 3 decades, right? And so maybe people threw out their grandfather's old journal, right? Or there's just not a consistent record, even if we do have a record from the 1890s, for example. Another challenge has been that when I started on the project, I think there was a lot of hope that I was going to be able to give a story for each single apple tree. And there are some exceptions, but for the most part, there's just not granular information, at least that has survived on those specific apple trees. Really, it's down, chance is getting down to the orchard level, which is great. But for me, it's almost kind of these regions, within the city and the county. And then this is something that those of you who have done local history will be familiar with. There's just a hearsay element to it, right? So I've gotten emails from people who are so helpful and just said, oh, I heard that like this person might have been involved with that thing, or this year was a bad year, my grandfather used to say, and that is great. I always want that information, but I actually have a document that just says vague leads, and I try to cross-reference when I can, but oftentimes I'm not able to find an additional piece of documentation, which really, unless I find something that's directly contradictory, it doesn't really have any bearing on what the person said. It's just that I can't confirm it with another method. So one of the ways that we've dealt with some of the gaps in the historical documentation is to conduct oral histories. And while we had one community history event, there was great hope on my part that we would have more in the spring, but we all know what happened to that plan. But the oral histories have been really great. A number of them, I don't think all of them are up yet, but a number of them are available online, including transcripts at Carnegie. Those transcripts are written by volunteers who spend hours doing that work. So it's a really wonderful way to give your time. And basically, this is a really great way of talking to people who have that knowledge and have that information within their family histories or within their personal histories. And oftentimes those people, and I just love it when this happens, will bring their records and their documents. Like, this is what I'm talking about. This is my multi-page, multi-year almanac of my personal orchard, that kind of thing, which is a real treasure when you're doing this kind of work. Then these community history events are something that has been, that I was trying out. And it was a way to bring neighbors together to talk about their trees. Because I was noticing when I was interviewing people, I would go down, I'd start at one part of the lane and knock on somebody's door, or, go at a prearranged time and say, hi, I'm Amelia, I'm with the Apple Tree Project. And they would say, oh, yes, well, I know this, but you need to talk to that person over there. Or, you actually need to talk to this other person who's the uncle of somebody's granddaughter somewhere, right? So I thought, oh my gosh, I just would love to get all these people in a room together. It'd be so much more efficient for myself. But also, I'm really curious to see, what memories and what experiences come up when you get a group of people together, rather than just asking questions one-on-one, which is the more traditional approach in history. So some of the questions that we asked at this community history event that was sponsored by the City Open Space in November, I think it was November, it was definitely the fall of last year, was how do you use your trees or the trees that are in your community? Who cares for those trees? And then also, do you feel there are any challenges facing those apple trees? And what value do they bring? That's a leading question, but really, if you're going to show up at a community history event about apple trees, like, nobody has ever said there's no value to the apple trees, but it's a self-selecting group. And I just wanted to pull out a few of the quotes that I have from that event. So when we got to this reflective stage of the event, talking about what the value was and what they can offer, one person said that a 100-year-old tree has a lot to say. It was a really great way of capturing it. Another said that you're living in your own orchard. Really loved. And then we sort of got to talking about how, as this other participant put it, these trees can foster other ways of thinking about sustainability, right? Ways that are maybe a little bit more integrated into urban and suburban life. We are so lucky here to have a really diverse kind of county. Diverse county. It's got agriculture, it's got industry, it's got sort of dense population, it's got suburbs, but so many of these apple trees are actually most dense where humans have been most dense, right? And so that's kind of a new and interesting way of thinking about sustainability in terms of agriculture. It's up to you, Chance.
All right, so I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the GIS methods that I used to find these orchards. So again, CU Boulder's historic aerial photo collection. Initially, I did this process called georeferencing, which is essentially where you look at an aerial photo and a modern satellite photo and find plot points that align on each, and then literally like drop little digital pins to the photo and the map like you were pinning a poster to a wall is kind of like the metaphor that's most easiest to kind of think about. But this is really challenging, not just because there's so few visible reference points, especially when you're looking at photos that are, from the 30s and 40s, not a lot is still around. But the photos also aren't taken from directly overhead. So they're slightly angled. And that means when you're georeferencing, the picture is going to kind of fold and warp as it's pinned to the map. And that can really mess with your accuracy, especially for the purpose of the Boulder Apple Tree Project, where we're trying to narrow it down to within a few blocks of where these orchards may have been. But CU Boulder has a robust earth sciences library, and one of the librarians there, Philip White, he was involved. He had some of his peers had made this beautiful GIS map that stitched together all of these aerial photos from this massive collection that ranged from Denver all the way up to Fort Collins, predominantly of just the Front Range. Not a lot into the valley or kind of the plains area, but yeah, they definitely had some advanced GIS skills and were able to stitch this all together, which was really critical to the use of my project. And interestingly, they were using it to track how wildfires had changed forestry over the last 80 years. And this is public data, so if you're interested in if anybody does use GIS and wants this information, wants this file, please let me know and I can direct you to the specific study that used it. Additionally, some of the stuff that was interesting about the methods that I was using is it didn't actually rule out, you can't rule out the presence of orchards pre-1930s. One of the things that I found that was kind of conflicting with what we were finding on the ground was there were no orchards in the 30s that overlapped with open space, right? And so, but we know that there were orchards that were on open space, and there are a lot of the trees that we wound up finding and surveying for the class were in these areas. So that adds kind of an interesting element to the story, whether that means that those orchards were just older or whether there's more of a human connection, kind of like what Amelia was talking about with homesteaders, the people who planted these trees. It may not have been for commercial use. It may have had a more personal use, more family history with it. But yeah, if anyone is interested also in in a map of where these orchard zones are within Boulder, please let me know. I'm happy to share that information too. If you want to see where you're living lines up with some of these orchard zones.
Yeah, so this is basically our last slide where we're going to talk. And I just kind of wanted to sum up a few of the key takeaways. So, next time you're like drinking a cider with your friends, you can kind of whip out this overview of apple history in Boulder. So it's kind of a combination of commercial efforts and family orchards that really kickstarted the earliest apple orchards in this area. And it was most likely a combination of government efforts and environmental factors that sort of ended that era. As Chance said, kind of by the 1930s and 40s, that's really the tail end of this sort of thriving moment that we've identified. And then, as we've both mentioned, the surviving cultivars are likely unique to Boulder or rare on today's commercial market. And not all of them are this way, but a number of them are seem to be drought tolerant and somewhat tolerant of environmental change, right? They've gone through a lot. And one can only assume that they have not received the same level of care consistently every year that they've been around for multiple human generations. And then finally, this is kind of what interests me the most, right? Is these layers of history and sort of the underappreciated aspects of history, or if not underappreciated, at least underdocumented, right? So the history of women's work and childhood, whether that be child labor or whether that be the generations of kids who have played in orchards and really built communities that way, chucking apples at each other, apparently. The local economy, even smaller than what we think about, the railroad between Denver and Boulder and Longmont, right? This is an even smaller scale economy that we've been able to really hone in on. And then finally, the history of community, of how people have been able to relate to each other and connect and share, you know, through food and through apples, and also just through kind of knowing, right, where these apple trees are in their neighbors' yards. So anyway, those are some pieces of history that I at least have not gotten that much outside of the apple history that we've been doing in Boulder. So our final slide is just some information in case you want to get more involved. Also, if you visit our website, we now have an interactive map up that some lovely computer science students at CU made for us. And then, as Marinus Smith said, old men plant trees, young men can't wait. I love that quote. I used it in almost all of my talks. So that's all we have. We are happy to take questions if that's what you all do in these meetings. Otherwise, thank you very much for having us.